Today we're going to be building a 1950s style Telecaster wiring harness. The major components for this project are a quality 3-position switch. In this circuit we're using an Oak Grigsby switch that can be purchased on Amazon, eBay, and other places for about $12 to $20. Next we have two CTS brand 250K solid shaft potentiometers, otherwise pots. I find these in pairs for about $14 and up. Then I purchased a 10-pack from Fender of the 0.05 microfarad capacitor on eBay for about $7. You can get them on Amazon for about 10 plus. Next, you'll need a really good Switchcraft 1/4-inch mono output jack, and it'll run you about $8 if you're buying them one at a time. Wiring is an important component. I use 22 gauge AWG stranded and pretend wire. Lately I've started using 18 gauge solid wire for parts of the circuit. Primarily some of the wire runs on the 3-position switch. I started using the legs that I cut off of the capacitors in this way, and I liked it so much that I bought a spool of wire matching basically the size of the legs that I were using prior. You do not have to do this yourself. You can use the 22 gauge wire throughout your wiring circuit. Red and black spools of wire bought in a set with enough wire to probably build about a dozen wiring harnesses will run you about $8 on Amazon. So the price breakdown for the circuit build, if you already own your own soldering iron, is about 66 cents for the wire, 70 cents for the capacitor, $13 for the 3-way switch, $14 for the two 250K ohm pots, and $8 for the output jack, for a grand total of $36.36. To buy a circuit with all of the components listed above, same name brands, that is fully assembled would start at around $65 and go up from there. In this circuit, there's a line of wires that are interconnected and made up of 5 pieces of wire that I've highlighted in red on the diagram on the screen that you'll see in a moment. The wires start at the top of the switch with 3 jumpers. The diagram shows the switch's pull pieces. The jumpers will run from pull piece 1 to 2, 2 to 7, and then 7 to 8. Then in the larger diagram, you can see it then shows a wire that extends from the 8 pole of the switch to the far left pole on the volume control. And then the last wire goes from the same volume control pole to the far left pole of the tone control. This is your first run of wires from end to end. I measure out by eye my wires, and then I pre-cut them so I'm ready to build the circuit. I then insert each of the wires starting from the top of the switch and moving down to the volume and tone controls. I do not solder the wires until I have finished inserting all 5 wires. I do it this way because 4 of the solder points of the 6 solder points have 2 wires inserted, and I have found that by walking down as I insert the wires is a good way of setting up the circuit to be soldered. For the first wire, this wire is a short piece of wire and has a jumper between poles 1 and 2 on the 3-way switch. I cut a piece of wire that is about 1/2 inch long and bend it into shape so it'll fit in the 2 poles holes. For the second wire, this wire is about 1 inch long and has a jumper between poles 2 and 7 on the 3-way switch. Again, I bent the wire into shape and dropped it into place. I'm careful while inserting the wire into pole 2 on this switch because there's already a wire inserted and not soldered into place, and I don't want to somehow cause it to pop out. For the third wire, this is identical in length to the wire that we used in the first wire. Now you're jumping between poles 7 and 8. Bend the wire into shape and drop it into place. Be careful when inserting into pole 7 so as to not displace the wire already inserted. For the fourth wire, the wire is about 1.5 inches long and runs between pole 8 on the 3-way switch and the far left pole on the volume control, as the diagram shows on the screen. I cut the length of wire and stripped off about 1/4 inch end on each end of the wire. Although already tinned, I heated each of the ends of the wire and let some solder flow onto the wire. When I soldered each of the ends, I get good solder flow and the wire ends are soldered in place to the 2 poles/lugs. The 5th wire is the last wire in this run and connects the far left pole of the volume control as shown in the diagram to the far left pole of the tone control. I cut a wire to a length of about 1.25 inches. I then stripped off each end and tinned each end as well with solder before inserting the ends into the poles/lugs on the volume and tone controls. Now I solder all 6 points. carefully melt the solder to secure each of the points wires in place. Again, like placing the wire, I move from top to bottom, soldering the points. I start at the top of the switch and I work my way down, starting with the volume control and then ending up soldering the lug on the tone control. Please note that all through this project, I make liberal usage of forceps for holding the control panel in place while I work on it, bending wires, and inserting wires into the different lugs/bowls. You can get a set of various sizes online for really inexpensive and well worth it. When you're all done soldering, inspect each of the joints to make sure that it is soldered in place, the solder is shiny and not dull, you don't have holes or gaps, and you can't pull the wires out so you have some sort of a failure later on in the guitar. Now carefully trim off excess wire that may be sticking out of each of the joints that you just soldered. Installing the capacitor. Installing the capacitor is easy. First, carefully bend the far right pull lug of the volume control until it almost or does touch the back of the pot. Then feed the legs of the capacitor through the middle pull lug of the tone control and the far right pull lug of the volume control, the one you just bent. Now solder the pull/lug of the middle of the tone control, followed by soldering the pull/lug of the far right pull of the volume control. Extend enough of the leg of the capacitor so it also lays on top of the back of the volume pot. Now you're going to solder the leg of the capacitor to the back of the volume pot. Be careful to not leave the soldering iron on the back of the pot for a long time. The solder should flow quickly and should only need enough to hold the cap leg in place. Once you are done, clip off the ends of the capacitor legs that are sticking out. Now we're installing ground wires and one hot wire. We're getting near the end of building the wiring harness. In the diagram, you can see 3 red and 1 brown, it's supposed to be red wires. The 3 that are bright red are grounds, and the one that's supposed to be red and is actually brown is the hot wire. The 3 grounds go to 3 different places. First, the back of the bridge, then to the inside cavity of the guitar, and last to the ground jack of the output jack. The hot wire goes from the middle pull/lug of the volume control to the hot lug of the output jack. I pre-cut my wires for each of these. I chose black for the 3 grounds and red for the hot wire for my colors. The longest wires are going to be the black wire, the ground, that goes to the back of the bridge, as well as the black and red wires that go to the output jack. You're going to have to just kind of measure yourself by the lengths of the wire. It's usually about 3.5 to 4 inches long for both. When I was done cutting everything and stripping the wires back, I took the 3 black ground wires and I twisted them together, and then I took solder and I soldered them together and tinned them in place. This way it was much easier to just solder one connector to the back of the volume control instead of trying to hold it together with 3 separate black wires while I was doing the soldering. Then once I was done soldering the black wires onto the back of the volume control, I took the 1 red wire that would go to the output jack as the hot wire, and I soldered it to the middle lug of the volume control. That's the potentiometer that's basically at the top near the 3-position switch. Now we move on to the output jack installation. The drawing/diagram on the screen shows the typical 2-lug mono 1/4 inch output jack. If you match the diagram to your jack, it'll help you identify which is the ground lug and which is the hot lug. One difference between installing an output jack on a Telecaster versus a Stratocaster is on a Telecaster you solder the jack onto the harness before installing it into the guitar, and on a Stratocaster you do it after you install the wiring harness and have pulled the wires through where the output jack would go. The jack on the Telecaster is then inserted through the cavity of the guitar and pulled through to the hole where the output jack would be inserted into the cup and held in place with the nut. Installing the control panel/wiring harness into the guitar. Installing the wiring harness/control panel into the guitar at this point is pretty easy. You have 4 pickup wires to solder into place. From the neck, you have a hot wire and a ground wire, and from the bridge, you have the same thing. Let's focus on the 2 hot wires. The hot wire from the neck pickup is soldered to the number 5 pull/lug of the 3-position switch, while the hot wire from the bridge pickup is soldered to the number 4 pull/lug of the 3-way switch. I inserted each of the 2 hot wires where they were supposed to be located on the 3-way switch and soldered them into place. For the 2 ground wires, I stripped back about a 1/4 inch of each black wire and then I twisted them together. After this, I soldered the 2 wires together. I placed a small amount of solder onto the back of the volume control pot's back, just enough to hold the 2 ground wires in place. Then once the solder was heated and flowing, I held the ground wires in place while removing the soldering iron and letting the solder harden.